The following program is brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org. That's novusordowatch.org.
Hello and welcome to Root of the Rot on the Restoration Radio Network. My name is Stephen Heiner and I'm joined as always by our guest for this program, His Excellency Bishop Daniel Dolan. Your Excellency, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure as always, Stephen.
We've got a lot to get into, but before we do any of that, I'll let you lead us in a prayer.
Thank you very much. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, amen.
Amen.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
O God, unto whom all hearts are open, all desires known, and from whom no secret is hid, cleanse the thoughts of our hearts by the inpouring of thy Holy Spirit, that we may perfectly love thee and worthily praise thee, through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.
Thank you, Your Excellency.
You're welcome.
So, Your Excellency, this is the French Revolution Part 2. And it was such a massive event. We talked in the last episode that episode might be the most important episode we've done so far. And not to denigrate the importance of this episode, but this is what happens next. Once the French Revolution has happened, this disaster, this catastrophe, we're left with the modern world in a way. It's just been, the explosions have kept going over time, and we are still dealing with the aftershocks of it. And there's a lot for us to cover. And I wanted to know whether you wanted to start by talking about Napoleon and his spread of these ideas, or the time after Napoleon.
Well, let's start with Napoleon, because in a sense, I think we could say that Napoleon is actually the most important part of the French Revolution. That is to say, of course, you have to have the ideas, the revolutionary ideas, those wretched ideas that are still with us today. But how are you going to go from the fire, the bloodshed, the disaster, literally the smoking ruins of French monarchical Catholic society into this brave new world, except by a man like Napoleon? He was a brilliant military strategist. He was perhaps certainly the most important figure of his age, but his real and his enduring and lasting importance is that he's the one who took the ideas of the French Revolution and made them work. He made them practical. I think of two things in his connection. The first of these is that just yesterday, we're recording the show on October 23rd, and just yesterday on October 22nd, the Novus Ordo kept their first feast day. I gag at the words of Saint John Paul the Great. He was the Napoleon of the Vatican II revolution. He, like Napoleon, took these revolutionary ideas and made them into a system. It's interesting, the Novus Ordo Church today is back at the French Revolution. That is to say, all this just blood and gore and attacks and destruction. But somebody has to come along, and somebody will, I'm sure of it, to institutionalize this further degradation of what's left of institutional Christianity. The other picture I have in mind as we begin today, Stephen, is that picture of the famous photograph of Hitler when he was making his victory tour of Paris, visiting the tomb of Napoleon and pausing with respect. The two of them truly were well matched, except that Napoleon's...
Kindred spirits.
Excuse me?
Kindred spirits.
Kindred spirits, quite. Except that Napoleon, the French can be proud of this at least. Napoleon won. Napoleon's ideas are still firmly in place today, not only in France but in a sense throughout the world. You have the Napoleonic Code, for example, in Louisiana, the state of Louisiana, still today. Whereas the ideas of the Third Reich and that particular form of National Socialism, which we'll look at later on in today's presentation, that's pretty much died out. That's died out. But whereas Napoleon, he may have died in exile, but he's the victor today. He can, from wherever he is, I hope he's not in hell, he can laugh that he had the victory over everybody else. How did he do it? Well, he did it by institutionalizing, as I say, the revolution. So he didn't just conquer much of Europe in a series of wars in order to maybe promote the glory of France, a narrowly nationalistic view. No, he wanted to make France the center of a great federal empire, and he wanted that the light of its new Enlightenment ideals should shine over all of Europe. And so by this means, he would destroy what was left of Christendom. That is to say, what they would refer to as feudalism, the feudal or the medieval well-organized society, certainly clericalism, and all of the traditions, anything that went against their concept of reason and their concept of equality. And the point is this: although that Napoleon was indeed defeated by Waterloo and at Waterloo and all of the rest, nevertheless, he set in motion a movement which would, in effect, destroy Christendom, the Christendom of Constantine and the Christendom of Charlemagne and the Christendom of St. Louis, the King of France. That would all be gone. And this he would do by a series not only of military conquests, but also and brilliant strategies, but also by a firm organization. He would set up native satellite governments. He would choose men, many of them from the lodges, of course, who would collaborate with the French and who would buy into all of these new ideas. They would in turn draft constitutions and laws that would specify the carrying out of the ideas of the French Revolution. That's how Napoleon finally won, and that's how the revolution got out after the initial bloodshed and fires were finished. I use the word, Stephen, I use the word feudal. And probably when American ears hear the word feudal, we're meant to cringe, and it would be akin to the word or the phrase the Dark Ages, because they want to make us to believe that they promoted the legal equality of all persons. But what they truly did was to give the government a complete, untrammeled, unquestioned authority over each individual subject. And all of the carefully defined rights and obligations of Christendom, of medieval society, they were all trodden underfoot. It was Napoleon who set the stage up for the all-powerful central government, which you see very much in France, and you see it very much in the United States today. So under the claim of legally equal individuals, you have the only right that you enjoy today, which is that of being utterly and totally subject to the central government.
Well, yes, and we've been tracing throughout this entire series this overthrow of the Christian order. And we look at the Christian order, be it in the year 800 or in the year 1200, not as this big brother government, as if the king has time to supervise what's going on in a particular county. Yes. Whereas Napoleon has all the time in the world to directly supervise and micromanage. And as you say, the legacy is still with us. Unfortunately, for those of us who have to deal with the French bureaucracy and the immigration paperwork, it is quite clear that Napoleon's legacy is alive and well.
Very much in place, and the Catholic the true Catholic social principle of subsidiarity, that things should be handled at the lowest possible level, and in the simplest possible way, that's buried. That's buried under a mountain of paperwork, and people seem comfortable to live and to do business that way. I think one of the reasons why the church had to go, Stephen, is that the church is the defender of the poor. She always has been the defender of the underdog. The church is the one who promotes rights. The church is the one who protects. They want to give us a picture of the church as oppressive and the Inquisition and all of the rest, but their work, the work of the Napoleonic conquests and the rewriting of the map of Europe, the rewriting of the laws of Europe, all of this was in order to destroy the Catholic Church as the advocate of the poor and a voice against, well, what would be in effect a new religion, which would be the religion of the Republic and the strong central government, the religion of governmentism, you might say. So the church property was confiscated. The monastic orders were either dissolved entirely or driven out, or else very, very much regulated. And in the Catholic countries, toleration became the law, and then eventually full rights became the law for Jews and for Protestants and for unbelievers. The so-called freedom of the press was also imposed. And Napoleon would compromise on some things. He would compromise, for example, on economic matters. He compromised on the question of the aristocracy. But he would absolutely refuse to compromise ever on the question of the clergy or the question of the principle of having a secular state. That's his legacy, isn't it? It's the secular state. But that's a misnomer. I think that we would hold that there's always a religion, and the religion today is a religion of secularism, and it's a religion of statism, perhaps most of all. Maybe you could reduce it to that. Today's religion is twofold. Don't be offended. Statism and sports, those two. And I suppose if you get enough statism, you'd be sort of driven to the soccer stadium on the weekend or something just for a little relaxation. I don't know.
Well,
but they're not.
Got statism plus sports equals the World Cup, Your Excellency.
I'm afraid so. And I'm afraid that the cup of God runneth over with wrath because of that, because no one is running into church for the worship of God anymore. So that's go ahead. Yes.
Your Excellency, people are going to now use this as an opportunity to attack the church vis-a-vis the concordat with Hitler, the concordat with Mussolini, and the concordat with Napoleon, that the church was part of the problem, right? You know, the church compromised with the Nazis because they had a concordat. The church compromised with Mussolini because they had a concordat. So can you contextualize concordats in general, obviously looking ahead to those ones in World War II, but looking back at this concordat with Napoleon, good for the church, bad for the church? Why did the church do it?
A concordat comes. You see the English word concord, or peaceful agreement, a peaceful way of life. In the word concordat, concordat is an agreement that's struck between the Pope and the ruler or rulers of a particular country, in which the mutual rights and obligations would be outlined. That's the definition of a concordat. The concordat that's struck between Pius VII and Napoleon in 1801 was the first of many, many modern concordats. It's the beginning of the church putting her 100% confidence in her diplomatic abilities and saying, well, this is a bad situation. We feel that this is the best that we can do in this situation for the glory of God and for the salvation of souls. The difficulty is that I think, with hindsight, it may be possible to maintain that many of these concordats depended too much upon human diplomacy and a certain naivete, at the very least, on the part of church authorities, not excluding the Pope when it came to secular politics, and not enough trust in Almighty God. So this the question of the concordance, and we'll talk about the specifics in a moment, but keep this in mind as we're talking about it. It's how should we act? How should we do? Would it be better for us to compromise and look the other way and keep the churches open and have catechism classes and have masses again and sacraments and be able to preach in a trammeled way, not freely entirely, but at least be able to keep up the business of the church somehow? Or should we stand our ground? Should we condemn the evil as we see it? And should we realize that in God's plan, persecution is not the end of the story. Persecution is just the pruning of the vine so that the fruit may be more abundant. The church, in her real politic, definitely from 1801 until the Novus Ordo era, the church has always favored the idea of a diplomatic solution, compromise, anything to avoid persecution. Basically, you could say, I think fairly, go along to get along. Has that been a good policy? I think it could be questioned, especially today, as we sit in the midst of the ruins of Jerusalem, and we survey what's left of the Catholic Church, and we see the smoldering ash and all the blood that's been shed. I'm thinking of an author, the centenary of whose death is just been marked in October of this year, Robert Hugh Benson, in that celebrated novel of his, The Lord of the World. If our listeners have never read this book, read it. It's a wonderful read, and it's utterly prophetic. And he and the the Pope figure talks about the coming of persecution as inevitable and as not a bad thing. And if you spoke to the great saints of the era of persecution, whether it be our North American martyrs with the savage Indians, or whether it be Elizabethan England, or the first 3 centuries, the Diocletians and the Neros, the church flourished because, as Tertullian said, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. So that's maybe a little bit of a background, and that's, as I say, read and discuss. Think about this a little bit. But the reality is that the church always chose, in modern times, the past 2 centuries, has always chosen the diplomatic approach. So the Holy Father, Pius VII, who was himself a gentle, peace-loving man. He had been a Benedictine monk, and was more than willing, in the measure possible, as he felt it, to compromise with the revolution. For example, when the revolution came to the city where he was Bishop Imola in Italy, he willingly and right away removed the throne, not the throne, but the canopy from over his throne, just as Paul VI would issue an instruction that be done as a result of Vatican II. And he also gave a Christmas sermon in which he, as much as possible, praised and idealized sort of a Catholic interpretation of the principles of the French Revolution. And that was sort of easy listening for the Freemasons and for the revolutionaries. Well, he wanted very much to see some sort of a compromise in place so that Catholicism could come back to France. And Napoleon wanted that too, because he saw he couldn't make it happen. He couldn't remember, he's the restorer. He wants to put things together and get everything working again. He couldn't do that without the aid of the church, without her tremendous influence, the influence of religion on the common people, the influence of religion in society as the binding force for stability. That just couldn't happen. So they both had an interest in mind, and they went back and forth, and they struck a deal. It's interesting that at some point the Pope, under terrific personal pressure from Napoleon, signed on to a little bit too much, and next day he regretted it, and he withdrew his signature, just as years later Archbishop Lefebvre would do that with Ratzinger in Rome. I
guess would we call that a French maneuver, Your Excellency, withdrawing your signature? It's would be repeated here.
I'm not actually familiar with the concept, except that it's happened twice. I don't know how that can work. If you sign something, you sign something. But what do I know? I'm just an American.
Well, this was before whiteout was invented. You're right.
Indeed, yes, unfortunately. But he indeed withdrew his he withdrew his signature. So then finally, they made some sort of a deal. But I think if you're talking about contextualizing the Concordat, you have to say, well, in that, yes, it was quite new because they gave up the right to all of their property, and they accepted in exchange for all of the property now being owned not by the church but by the secular church, the state, that they would the clergy would receive their salaries from the state. But he who gives out the money, he calls the tune too. Of course, it's the one who signs your paycheck after all. And so the state now had to not only agree to the naming of bishops, which Leo X had already done, you might say in a sense giving away the store of all things to Francis I in 1516. But more than that, not only is the state going to now name the bishops, with the Catholic Church just reserving the power to approve or disapprove of the man that the state wants to put into a see, but now the state has the right as well to look over the pastors of parishes. Wow. So it's Pius VII set up a structure that would allow the French state totally to control the church in France, and there'll be all sorts of grief and problem, and as we'll see, of divisions too, which came of this really unfortunate practical arrangement. I think of the Freemasonic revolutions in Mexico. Same thing. The church seized the church's property was seized by the government, and in effect, the church was entirely subject to the government. That's a French idea. It's a Freemasonic idea that the church has no right to own property. Saint that we one of the greatest popes of all time, St. Callistus, whose feast we kept earlier this month of October, he was the first one in already the 200s to vindicate the church's right to own property. He not only cemeteries but even secular buildings. A tavern actually, which he bought and converted into a church in honor of Our Lady, and it was an established principle even in the Roman Empire that now the church has a right to exist, but when you give up the right to own property, do you have the right to exist? Well, no, just at the good pleasure of the local government. Well, I think that we could probably all agree that at the very least, it was it seemed to the Pope to be the most prudent thing that he needed to do. But in hindsight, this Concordat was a disaster for not only the French Church, but for the universal, for the Catholic Church. It was a terrible thing that this should have been done. And it's interesting to note there were some French, especially imbued as they are with the Gallican principles of opposition, the spirit of French ecclesiastical independence and opposition to the power of the Pope and of Rome, minimizing it as much as possible. There were some French who just wouldn't accept it, and they became what's known as a little church, a petite église, which still exists today, curiously and interestingly enough. And that's a little bit of that tradition. There's so much of your R&R, and that does not stand for Restoration Radio. That stands for Recognize and Resist. That movement draws its inspiration from. It's sort of a bit in a line with. So there actually was a petite église that went into schism because they refused to accept the revolution that had now been institutionalized by Napoleon and blessed, in a sense, as the best that the church could do at this moment by the Holy Father, by Pope Pius VII.
It's interesting, Your Excellency, you say we're still living with the effects of it. I was talking with Father Legal, who's my pastor here in Paris, and it was around Epiphany, and I was asking about Holy Days of Obligation, and he mentioned, well, that was suppressed. This was one of the holy days of obligation that was suppressed by Napoleon, and that the French used to have 10, and it was reduced to 6. And again, we think about, back to what you were saying, this is Napoleon arbitrarily deciding, okay, I'm going to just see how far I can push the church. And of course, as you're saying, a practical deal, the Holy Father can look at this and say, okay, we're going to lose 4 holy days of obligation. Are we going to die on this hill or not? And you're talking about that human diplomacy. Whereas we might say, look, holy days of obligation are pretty important. And if they're part of the secular sphere, that means everyone else has to take them off too and recognize that this is part of the Christian faith. And when you reduce that footprint from 10 to 6, you are inevitably just eroding the Christian sense of things. And we still have some of those that from the Concordat of 1801 are still honored by, quote unquote, honored by the Fifth French Republic, the disgusting form of government they have in present day France. But as you say, this is the church in a way getting cornered, right, by the strong man in the room.
Yeah, I think that you really have to say that, since we're talking about the root of the rot here, Stephen, and as we connect it back, we look at Leo X, who in some respects was a great pope, although probably not that holy and worthy of an individual personally. But he gave away the store to Francis I. And then there were other popes during the so-called age of the Enlightenment. One of the movements, talking about holy days, was for the Universal Church to reduce the number of holy days. We had not only 10, but we had a zillion holy days. That goes back to the medieval idea of a proper balance, because everything in Christendom is properly balanced. And so there were all these feast days in which you were obliged to hear Mass, abstain from servile work, and then there were other feast days in which you were obliged at least to hear Mass in the morning, and then some of the other obligations during the day were a little bit lessened. But before the French Revolution, many of these were abolished and then reduced to the title that you may have heard. The term is Feasts of Devotion. For example, the Feast Days of the Apostles. I remember reading the life of Bishop Challoner, who's one of the great vicars apostolic of England, just around the time of the French Revolution or slightly before, commenting to his people that, well, unfortunately, now Rome has abolished all of these holy days, reduced them to just a relatively small number. Perhaps it was 6, perhaps it was 10. But nevertheless, he told the people, we should still, and this is a persecution, mind you, the Gordon riots, and we must still do our best to hear Mass on these days and to keep the spirit of these feasts that are now at least feasts of devotion. So you have the church retrenching. You have the church leaders compromising with with what? With the spirit of the world, the spirit of the modern age, with the so-called signs of the times. What has that ever gotten us? Except it's made us smaller and smaller and has put us in the corner. Too much human reasoning, I'm thinking, if you want to talk about the root of the rot, and not enough sort of viva Christo Rey, not enough muscular Catholicism here. But our duty is at least to in this show in this series to trace the root of the rot, and this spirit of go along to get along, of kind of a worldly diplomacy is certainly a major player. If you ask the question, how did it happen? Another important point to make here is I think the historical perspective that this series, I hope, will give to our audience. That is to say, recall that this happened even in the Middle Ages with that French king Philip the Fair, his attack upon the Pope, and the false principles of laicism and of nominalism. So we're talking not only France here, but Scotland and Italy and Germany. All of whom made a contribution to this revolution that takes you finally to the institutionalizing of the French Revolution. That one of the distinctions that one could make would be, with the other kings with whom the Church, in her prudence, decided to compromise, you were dealing with those who were at least officially or on the outside or externally Catholic monarchs, crowned, consecrated Catholic monarchs. With Napoleon, you were dealing with a man who was more of a Nero than any sort of a Catholic monarch, and who was essentially a pagan because he was essentially a Freemason. And you see that in the whole drama of the coronation of Napoleon. So there's the Pope. He accepts the invitation to go and to crown the new emperor, and once again, meekly sort of hoping for the best out of this particular situation. There's no question, the Pope is told, and his ministers, of having a Catholic coronation ceremony in Mass. No, that there'll be a ceremony, and but we're going to write it out. It was sort of a novus. Interesting. It's sort of like a novus ordo coronation ceremony for an emperor, and then even those rubrics at the end were not followed. And at the last minute, Napoleon seizes the crown from the Holy Father, how symbolic, and he plops it right on his own plunky head. He declares and crowns himself the king. That's the spirit. That's the spirit of modern man, who refuses to submit himself to Christ the King. And this, just a foot or two away from the humiliated vicar of Jesus Christ, the Pope, who, impotent, is seated upon his throne. Nothing he can say here, and nothing that he can do. That's the modern revolution, Stephen. I think. Who's the artist? Is that Delacroix?
Jacques Louis David.
Okay, David. It's David. Yes, it's David. It's seized in David's moment. Look at the expression on the Pope's face. Look at the scene, and it's a picture before which we could well pause and just sort of contemplate the sad reality. The Pope has been reduced to a figurehead. That's what they want, and the king and the high priest, that's Napoleon now.
I have a couple of reflection points there, Your Excellency. One is, part of our purpose in this program is to try to give people a deep view. You know, when we have Vatican II, we have this recent disgusting synod that just happened. People keep looking at those things as events in isolation, and they don't connect the dots and say, well, no, look, there's a reason Vatican II happened, and part of this series is illustrating, yes, look at all of the paths that were paved in order to make this easy, and part of that would be some of the spirit and the implementation of some of those concordats. The second is, as you were describing that scene, I'm taken back to that huge painting, which is the second largest painting in the Louvre. The largest is the Wedding Feast of Cana.
Ah, yes.
And which is very funny. That one in its own, it's this Wedding Feast of Cana in a Venetian courtyard painted for Franciscans. That's another story. But
that's for another show. But an interesting point.
But yeah, David took 3 years to paint that painting, and yes, you can see Pius VII. He looks quite sad. David also did a separate. Our best portrait of Pius VII comes from David. You can see his hand is just forward in a slight blessing. That's all he's here for. He's just here to bless Napoleon. And right. Napoleon himself, as the rewriter of history, had David paint his mother into that painting, because his mother was in Rome, because she didn't approve of this empire. She didn't approve of Josephine being crowned empress without having delivered an heir, etc. And this is Napoleon. He is the modern man. He is the self-created. This before the internet. The internet where you can go back and change your blog entry to be correct, and nobody ever knew it was wrong. Napoleon can create this painting, instruct David, make sure my mother is in this painting, even though she didn't come.
Or the communists with their early attempts at photoshopping and right. putting people in the Politburo in the painting or out of the painting, depending right. on their status.
The person is no
right.
longer there.
Yeah, he anticipated all of just something. Remember, just a hat at some point. Just a hat showed up in the picture. Yeah, he anticipated all of this, the use of the plastic arts as propaganda, and brilliantly so. That's yet what is that? That's yet another reason that he's this pagan high priest and pagan ruler, succeeded to where Julian the Apostate failed. Napoleon the Apostate was brilliantly successful. He used well all of these means, and before him, the church was silent. Before him, the church was impotent. So that happened, as I say, and I don't think we could stress it too much, was because of a certain naivete about the nature of the revolution, the nature of Freemasonry, and the failure of the church to see that This is now a new age, an age of revived paganism and worse, of anti-Christianity, which will ultimately produce the final Antichrist. So you have the church sort of set up for, and you see this in American history too. Less than French. In French history, you see the church set up for the opposition of the liberals versus the Catholics, the anti-liberals. Whereas in the United States, while you have that same conflict in the 19th century, I think you can say that almost all the way through, by means of a certain gentleman's agreement, with a few exceptions, just a few German or Irish bishops, whoever would speak about these things would be ostracized and isolated. It simply was not done. So the idea is to go along to get along. And that's the spirit of the Concordat. That's the spirit of the reaction of the Catholic Church, more or less. Even though sometimes there will be in the most vehement objections, the letter of we'll see later on, the letter of the same Pope Pius VII to the Bishop of Troyes during the Restoration of Louis XVIII, objecting very bitterly to, and then of course all the writings of Pope Pius IX, objecting to all the Masonic and condemning all the Masonic ideals. They will be condemned, but on the practical level, in a diocese, a national hierarchy, or a parish, would it be preached against and condemned? No, probably not. Probably not. What you're set up for is that the church has now, in effect, by means of the Concordat, the church is now functioning. Sacraments are being given, as I say, confirmation, catechism. All these things are available. Once again, marriages are being blessed, and Catholic social life, family life is slowly returning, not to what it was before, but returning to something, some vision of Christendom. But you're left with this bitter heritage. What's that? That the church would now be divided into two camps: the camp of liberal Catholicism, those who wanted to see an accommodation of the Catholic Church with the so-called new civilization, principles of the Revolution, and then those who truly Catholic realize it's impossible for the Church to accommodate herself to this new Freemasonic or revolutionary thinking, and that it needs to be condemned forthrightly and frequently. So amongst the liberals will be all those French names, Monseigneur Dupanloup and Lamennais and Lacordaire and Montalembert. And then in the United States, you have characters like Archbishop Ireland, Bishop England of Charleston, North Carolina, the celebrated Father Isaac Hecker, founder of the Paulist Fathers, Cardinal, the long surviving Cardinal Gibbons of Baltimore. But amongst those who refuse to go along with it, obviously are going to be popes. Indeed, will fall into that category, such as the glorious predecessor of Pius IX, Gregory XVI, Cardinal Lambruschini, Pius IX himself, after 1848, after he learned his lesson about the revolutionaries and revolutionary doctrine. St. Pius X, most of all, Dom Guéranger, the great Cardinal P, and many others, But so you're set up for, well, the Concordat of 1801 set us up for Vatican II, didn't it? Set us up for the so-called conservative or traditionalist versus liberals. And Archbishop Lefebvre historically would fit very much into the camp of the Catholics who refused to go along with the revolution. But if so many others could have promoted it for so long, despite the best efforts of St. Pius X, it's because of Pius VII. It's really, this is the legacy of the Concordat.
Well, and I want to come back to tie this off at the end of our episode today, but it's probably a good time for us to talk about the horrible ideas that were spread by the march of Napoleon's extremely effective army. So we'll move from history to the intellectual life, and we're going to talk about the army of isms.
Yes, isms. We are now in a world of isms, and what we want to do now, Stephen, is simply to define and discuss briefly, in sort of an overview, many of these isms that we've spoken about before, and we will have occasion to speak about more in other shows. But we have to give just some definitions, and then this is time to, as you would say, Stephen, to eat your spinach, or as my teachers used to say, put on your thinking cap, because we have to get into philosophy, and we have to get into horrible, ugly, modern philosophy. So, but we have to have at least some idea, because you'll every now and again, stay with me here, because every now and again the penny will drop you and say, oh yes, I know this or that example, because remember, ideas matter. The bad guys realize that ideas matter. We Catholics have to also realize that. The first ism we want to speak about is the modern German philosophy, with transcendentalism and pantheism. This is all rooted in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, or Kantism, which in return has its roots in nominalism. We've spoken about nominalism earlier, the great influence it had upon Martin Luther, and its unfortunate introduction into the Catholic world already in the Middle Ages. So Kant carried nominalism a little bit further, and maintained that human knowledge consists only in what he calls phenomena, a knowledge of appearances, and these things can be organized by our own mental categories. That's what you can know, just categories of the mind. But you can't really. The idea always is the same. The mind produces reality. There's no such thing as an out there objective reality, because if knowledge doesn't come from out there, it just comes from inside, from us, from ourselves. This leads to another ism, which is called idealism. This makes the ideal prevalent over the real. Kant's followers understood the consequences of all of this, and this becomes then what they call German transcendentalism. Some big German names like Schelling and Fichte, they go along with this. For another show, and for a more talented philosopher, would be a very interesting discussion of the infiltration of the traditional movement, and particularly the Pius X Society, by Kantism and Fichte, by means of the second Superior General of the Pius X Society, Father Schmidberger, who was a trained follower of Kant and Fichte, and somehow it was able to claim with a straight face, and I suppose still today does, so do some German sedevacantists, that no, this is not in any way opposed to Catholicism, and this is the only valid philosophy. Go figure. But all of this is going to lead to it's important to talk first about this. It will lead to so many other modern errors: evolutionism, modernism, Marxism, and subjectivism, perhaps most of all. Our next ism to look at is a sort of a twofold evolutionism. If you even Protestant conservatives, American speakers and ministers have realized the effect, the incredible and very, very harmful, deleterious effects of evolutionism in our world. There is what we call an idealistic evolutionism, and then a materialistic evolutionism. Continuing along with the ideas of the subjectivism and Kant and the rest, we have Hegel. He is very, very important for understanding how what Bergoglio calls the Leo, the mess, the chaos. The Novus Ordo Bishop of Providence, Rhode Island, just said the other day, well, he says he believes in the creation of chaos, and he's sure done a good job. That's interesting. But Ratzinger, too, being a good German, a modern philosopher, Ratzinger, too, is a follower of all this. We call it the Hegelian dialectic. It sees all of reality in a constant flux. And the way you're going to get to something, this is their modern idea. See it in practice in the conciliar church, with Ratzinger establishing a high church movement, with Bergoglio seemingly reducing everything to fighting and bitter chaos, rioting in the streets almost. The idea is that you have a thesis, and then you have so the thesis would be, say, the natural law: marriage lasts until death, or a marriage can only be between a man and a woman. And then that's opposed to the antithesis, oh no, there must be pastoral practice and mercy and da-da. They love each other. They should be able to get married and be able to share the bread and wine at our Eucharist every week. That's the antithesis. And then, then there's a seeming world war or riot in the streets. What comes as a result of all of this? They believe, that's their reading of history based on their philosophy, you get a synthesis. That's what they're after.
You get a new synod document.
Yes, well, you'll get 1 year from now, and it'll be quite different from what's going on now, because that's when Napoleon, he sort of steps out of his sepulcher at is it Les Invalides? Is that where he is?
Yes.
That's where he reposes, the poor soul. He's going to step out of his sepulcher.
He's going to step out of all six coffins he's entombed in. Yeah.
That's right, exactly, one after another, and he'll join all the rest of these modern demons and say, yes, see, we have institutionalized the revolution. This idea of, we're just speaking about our isms so far. I want our readers to see, or our listeners rather, to see, to think through and realize the importance of ideas. Now, but there's also, and not to forget, a material or materialistic evolutionism, and of course, right away, one to think of the Englishman Charles Darwin. And those ideas, the ideas of evolution, evolutionary truth, and their philosophical underpinnings are immensely important for understanding the modern world and the modern mentality. And of course, this is one of the greatest and the most indisputable of doctrines, joining perhaps even global warming, I don't know, as truths, and the Holocaust as truths that are never ever to be questioned, much less to be denied. After evolutionism, then we go to something maybe a little bit more general once again. You've heard the term. It's rationalism. Since Kant glorifies human reason, there was a whole tendency in 18th century philosophy to make that applied to religion and to oppose it to supernatural revelation. That gives us the rationalists, who deny the possibility of miracles and any form of a true supernatural revelation at all. Remember, that's a Masonic idea too, because God is the deistic God. He's out there. He doesn't really intervene in human events. We believe in a God, but not a God who's part of history. And then there are also those who there often will be in all of these isms those who take a little bit more of a gradualistic approach. So we have what was known as the semi-rationalists, those who accept they accept Christian dogma, but maintain that everything could be explained by reason. Pope Leo XIII, in his condemnation of Americanism, would point that out as one of the evils of this school of thought, that everything in Catholicism could be explained by human reason, and therefore was supremely reasonable, and Protestants should therefore join this new version of Catholicism. This is back in the 19th century. Then we have positivism, another ism. This is Auguste Comte, who just extends the work of Kant. Now he dies in 1842. So he's taking us into the 19th century. He denies the possibility of having any form of metaphysics. He denies that there are any final causes, that there's any absolute at all. That knowledge for him consists only in certain facts and the relation of one fact to another, and that theology is to be dismissed as that's just a primitive way of explaining natural events. Our next ism is pragmatism. This is interesting because it touches a little bit, Henry James said, the American character and the American mentality. This is a way of translating those high ideals of idealism into the practical order. This is taking something very theoretical and trying to making it very, very practical. What's that? Remember, that's the work of Napoleon. Idealism's basic principle is that the mind precedence over physical reality. You can see that in the curious American sect Christian Science. The 19th century, they were extremely popular because these philosophical ideas were well received and extremely popular. The pragmatists said that the will to power is the principle of existence. Life is merely an instinct to obtain power. So pragmatism influences everybody from the founders of Christian Science with the phone in her coffin, Mary Eddy Baker, right, all the way to the Übermensch, the Superman, Friedrich Nietzsche. Profound influence on German thought, and that leads you to Hitler, who was a great admirer of Nietzsche. And as I say, there's an American connection too. William James identifies the truth with what works. If it works, it's got to be true. There's something sort of deeply American in that viewpoint. Whereas for the French, they would simply dismiss it. Whether or not it works makes no difference at all, except it'd be one more thing for the French to argue about. But as long as it's an idea, then we'll discuss it, or we'll fight each other over it. Whereas Americans would rather set aside all the ideas. Imagine we're going from idealism now to a seeming opposite, to pragmatism. If it works, it must be good. Let's accept it and try to impose it as an answer. Next, ontologism. This is again, it's this idea of idealism, which touches theology to a certain degree. Being in general is now just being. Is now identified with divine being. Man is born with an immediate knowledge of the divine. And this knowledge is expressed by the use of the verb to be. I admit when we talk about ontologism, Stephen, that we're getting a little complicated, but I want to mention it because it certainly is a philosophical movement of the 19th century, very important, particularly because you have one of your Novus Ordo saints who was a famous ontologist, Antonio Rosmini, the founder of the Fathers of Charity, the Rosminian Fathers. His philosophy was condemned by the Church later on under, I think, St. John Paul II, if I'm not mistaken. He was totally, that saint we're putting quotation marks, he was totally rehabilitated, and Rosmini himself was proclaimed a saint of the Novus Ordo. So those are some of the philosophical trends and philosophical schools that affect us still today, that reach across the ocean to the New World, and which are sometimes in their roots, in the tendrils that they send out, the branches that they sprout, seemingly opposed to each other. But there you have it. That's a little bit about modern thought. Well, then we can move on from modern philosophical thought to modern political and economic thought or theories. This takes us to a definition of the word liberalism. You hear people describing themselves or describing each other as liberal. What do we mean by that? So we're going to talk about the classic meaning and then the popular or received usage today. Liberalism is a political theory, and it is an economic theory too. Concerning politics, it applies these bad Enlightenment Masonic ideas that we've been speaking about in this series to politics and to religion. Classic liberalism is very close to the modern movement of libertarianism, which is pretty much out there today in many conservative circles. And it's interesting to see what the links are here. It enshrines freedom, libertarianism does, as does classical liberalism, as an end in itself. It holds that human beings ought to be free to do whatever they want to do as long as they don't cause any physical harm to someone else. I think you can say that's pretty much of a definition of what we call libertarianism today. And furthermore, that left to themselves in an atmosphere of perfect liberty, human beings will always manage somehow to choose the right thing, and that society will benefit as a result of this overall. Classic liberalism calls for freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all of these freedoms that have been so eloquently and frequently condemned by the true Catholic popes, especially in the 19th century. One of their mottos is a free church in a free state, and they see the state, a state which is indifferent to religion, leaves religion alone almost entirely, as an ideal state. That's all of this is on paper, but the reality is that all of this is used as a key and as a ploy, as a means of actually achieving exactly the opposite, the total subjection of people by a hypocritical presentation of these so-called liberties. Well, that's liberalism as a political theory. Liberalism now, from an economic point of view, holds that the very best form of economics is, we've all heard that French phrase, laissez-faire. It's laissez-faire, I think that's the correct pronunciation. Let them do it. Literally means let them do it economy, in which the government doesn't intervene in any way at all, but permits everyone to find his way in some sort of economic free-for-all. The centralized economies of many states under socialism, national or international socialism, and even in certain countries, France in particular, would contradict this pure liberal, or we would say today libertarian philosophy. From liberalism, we can move on to its logical consequence, which is socialism. We'll look at socialism in and of itself, and socialism as a national socialism, or socialism as an international socialism, and finally the movement of what we call internationalism itself. Socialism holds that the people are sovereign, and that great dogma of the French Revolution, everybody is equal. All are equal as citizens, and that nothing can get in the way, this is important, between the state and the individual. So you have to have an all-powerful state, and then you have the individual standing before the state. There's no church. There are no rights. There isn't any. There are no guilds. There are no customary laws that are going to deflect the death ray of the state as the state surveys the individual citizen in the name of equality. Interesting. This all-powerful state makes laws then for every aspect of human life, and there's no other institution, not even the family, that has the right to make its own rules. And you see this in practical application of vaccinations, to homeschooling issues, to religious issues. We'll probably see it in the matter of gay marriage sometime fairly soon. So our first aspect about socialism is to consider that it leads to an all-powerful state. We're not looking so much about the question of how the all-powerful state seizes and then redistributes the wealth. No, that's secondary. The main thing is the all-powerful state, no intermediary between it and we say it's citizens, but really we mean its subjects. National socialism is also known as fascism. We see it in the movements in Italy and in Germany, with Hitler and with Mussolini. Often, National Socialism is confused with something good or something sort of conservative and for the old traditional values. But actually, they were socialists. So they were part of this revolution, and their main interest, however, as socialists, was not, as I say, the redistribution of the wealth or even the central control of the economy by the government. The main interest was the all-powerful state that would dictate, with no appeal, every aspect of the life of the individual, whether it be economic or family, social, or religious, educational. That's National Socialism. Then we have to look at communism, which is that distinction, by the way, I find very useful when it comes from Father Fahey. We have to look at communism, and that gives us international socialism. It's a form of socialism in its more radical form. Some forms of socialism, especially national, by no means require the abolition of private property, but only its control by the central government. Now, pure communism demands that all property and all means of production should be owned and controlled by the all-powerful state. So when we're talking about creeping socialism, that's where we're going with this. And well-known communists were, of course, Karl Marx and Engels. Then the connection that we will make later on between this and a militant anti-religious atheism gives us the modern movement of communism today. Taking libertarianism one step too far, you have the anarchist movement, which is very, very active in Europe and in the United States, again in the 19th century, holding that all governments should be simply done away with, and that human beings only need to enter into agreements with each other to conduct their business and to keep the peace. So that there's no use for any government at all. So that's carrying libertarianism to a particular extreme, anarchism. For the 19th century, we also have to look at the movement of nationalism, which is still very much with us today. So all nationalism is a good example of filling the void, plugging the hole that is left by the loss of Christendom, a Christian society. So you've got to worship something, and that something that you're going to worship is the state. There's a healthy and a sane nationalism, but we would describe it as the virtue of patriotism, which comes under the natural virtue of piety, the love for one's country, one's homeland, where one is born. Whereas the nationalism of the 19th century in particular was exaggerated. And as I say, it's the result of the secularization of society. When you take religion away, when you take the church away from the daily life of people, then what do people have left? They're just pure materialists. So they have to have some kind of an ideal, and that ideal, of course, is going to be the state. And so demagoguery is going to make its appearance. The politicians will stir them up against others. You see a classic example of this kind of nationalism replacing religion after the so-called Quiet Revolution of the 1960s in Quebec, the French-speaking province of Canada. It was Catholic and French-speaking, and during the era of the changes, went from being a Catholic, very much of a Catholic country, if you will, with a wonderful French heritage, to being absolutely secular and godless and very, very nationalistic. Their religion now became the hatred of the English. Say what you want about the English, it seems a little exaggerated, and their hatred of the English language and English culture. So they wanted to promote their own culture and way of life, but without any religion. Religion was just sort of there in the background.
Well, the hatred of English by the French is always humorous, given that English is 35% French influence thanks to the Norman invasion. But
yes,
you have to not know history in order to hate English without being French, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, yes. I think you can fairly say that most of the people that are going to be taken in by all these isms are people who really don't know history, and they are easily stirred up. But then one sees too that human hunger, the hunger of the heart, of what's left of the soul, for some sort of a religion replacement. And so the politicians are going to be there, and the church is gone. The church is just caved before this quiet revolution of secularism and materialism. And so what's left? The worship of the statism, the worship of the government is going to step in and then manipulate people for their own wicked purposes. And of course, that prejudice was always there to be able to be profited from. The opposite, another movement, also very popular in the 19th and 20th century, which is still very much with us today, and quite the opposite, again, is that of internationalism, which is associated with Freemasonry most of all, and also with world Jewry and communism and socialism. There's two forms of socialism, really. And it consists in the call for nations to give up their national sovereignty. It's the opposite. But somehow these are both roots, or these are both tendrils of that the same work of the secret societies against the natural or the Christian order. So states should give up their sovereignty in favor of an international socialist organization. After World War I came the League of Nations, which was not interested in hearing anything from the Pope or giving the Pope a seat. And after World War II came the United Nations, which received, curiously enough, a blessing from the Pope, from Pope Pius XII, who hoped for the very best from this humanistic and nationalistic gathering, not seeing probably what its real roots were, or its real and its true wickedness. So that's the movement of internationalism. And then we have, last of all, another word which is always bandied about, democracy. This is the natural result of the ideas of the Enlightenment and of the French Revolution. The Masons, and all of these terms, you can see how they're devoid of not only any uplifting, theologically correct or spiritual truths, but they're words that are just used in order to be turned on their ends, so as to promote the end of the glorification of the power of the state, who's ever running the government. Democracy is possibly the worst example of that at all. So that the Freemasons throughout Europe, as a result of World War I, established their democracies. Monarchies were reduced as a result of World War I to being mere constitutional monarchies, where the king or the queen is simply a figurehead. The real power is concentrated in the so-called democratic forms of government. But we know from history that all of these things are at the best manipulated, and at the worst just an external show. That these are always a question of some form of an oligarchy, which manages to seize and to maintain control using the popular terminology of democracy. But the reality, of course, is not going to be there. So those are some political and some economic theories. If everybody is still awake, we have.
Well, let me remind our listeners who are still with us, trudging through some difficult stuff for sure, but this is how you learn things. You don't. Nothing worth knowing is easily spoon-fed. It's something that's going to take engagement, and it's going to take some work. And for those who are listening, just a reminder that Root of the Rot is a production of the Restoration Radio Network. All rights are reserved. Any duplication without explicit written permission is forbidden. You may obtain permission by writing to mail, @truerestoration.org.
So how does that work, Stephen? How does that work then for, as you're saying this, and I'm going through all of these isms, I'm thinking to myself, probably someone who's serious about getting a grasp on all of this would want to listen, not necessarily to this particular show, but to something on Restoration Radio more than once. How does that work if a listener wants to listen to it again and again?
Well, if you purchase it, then you get the episode, and you download it. And then
it's yours, and you can download it whenever you want to.
You can listen to it. You can listen to all the isms as many times as you'd like, Rick.
Excellent. Well, that's what I'm going to recommend as a take-home from this particular show, is you want to purchase it and you want to make it yours, and a little contract here, and Des, and listen to it again and again, because the first time it could be a little overwhelming, but you want to get these ideas in your head. You want to understand a little bit about Hegel and Kant, because that's your father Schmittberger, and that's Ratzinger and Bergoglio. Wow, interesting. And then you want to hear a little bit about the popes and the concordats and all of these isms, be able to put them all in their proper place. So let's do some more isms, Stephen. Let's talk about theological isms. We want to talk about liberal Catholicism and biblical rationalism
I was going to say, now
Spiritism.
you're swerving back into the red meat territory. So we've had all our vegetables and our salad.
We've eaten our vegetables.
Now we have people who are rubbing their hands. They can't wait to hear about theological stuff. So I'll let you.
Excellent.
Deliver the steak.
They've earned their steak, and I hope they like it. They hope they like it singlant, nice and bloody, because that's what we specialize in. Liberal Catholicism. You will be familiar with movement. Simply, it is this. Simply stated, the movement seeking to adapt the faith, Roman Catholicism, revealed religion, to the principles of the French Revolution, which calls for a state which is indifferent towards religion, the ideal being a so-called free church and a free state, which would theoretically leave the Catholic Church free to function as it pleases, but in reality leaves the Catholic Church far more chained than ever she was during the Christian centuries, which preceded the French Revolution. We move from that just a brief dusting of liberal Catholicism to rationalism, biblical rationalism. We talked about rationalism and semi-rationalism in a philosophical or a general sense. Now we want to speak about this trend, which is a trend really towards impiety and a refusal of the gift of faith, which leads to eventually, followed faithfully, will lead to a denial of all supernatural revelation, even the very possibility that there should be supernatural revelation. You got the rationalists always have to be on the scene to demythologize, that's their phrase, demythologize sacred scripture, whether it be the crossing of the Red Sea or Noah's Ark or whatever it might be, to give everything a rational explanation, every kind of a supernatural event. And Stephen, I just read the other day, and isn't this interesting, that yes, somebody came forward to demythologize Fatima and the miracle of the sun. How could the miracle of the sun have occurred? Because there's no scientific evidence of anything like this. There were just all those hundreds of thousands of people that witnessed it. That was all. Well, a certain Stanley Jackie, who was a Hungarian, a winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. He was a Benedictine father and a great scientist, I think, considered so in his own right. He provided the world with a demythologizing of the miracle of the sun, if you can believe it, in which somehow he's got ethers and he's got weather movements and light and all of these explanations, so that he's managed to cobble together so as to pass muster in the modern world. Because as we all know, everything must be demythologized. The idea that God, the maker of all, should actually work a simple miracle of the sun that's not in their categories. And because it's not in their categories, they would not even consider it. So someone has even attempted to demythologize the miracle of the sun of Fatima. Theosophy.
We've heard that on Francis Watch, the idea that for the feeding of the 5,000 people, we're just carrying their own bread. And our Lord was just encouraging them to share. Right?
They shared it with each other. That's one of Bergoglio's few dips into the pool of modern scriptural rationalism. But that's I guess maybe you might say that's one of the things he remembered from his classes in the 60s, and he likes to repeat it. Theosophy and Spiritism. These were two very, very strong movements in the 19th century, United States, England, very much so, but also in Europe. Kind of died out, and you don't hear that much about it, but Theosophy was certainly still active in this country. Even during the time of the changes, you would hear about it. Theosophy is a system which emerges from a fascination of non-believers with the occult, a fascination with this idea of pantheism, that everything is God. The system of Theosophy holds that man can directly have an understanding, a grasp of the divine essence, and this would only make sense because they are God, or They're part of God, and by means of theosophy and the system of what the theosophists hold as a system of teachers who come from another plane, another astral plane. The ascended masters are referred to. You can have a knowledge of the secret forces of the universe, and that will unleash great power in your life, and figure out how like pyramids are going to sharpen your razor blades, things like that. Very useful in daily life. The theosophists are very much connected with the occult and have an interesting connection with liberal Catholicism, so-called liberal Catholicism, as a particular sect or movement, which is a sort of a wedding of theosophical principles, which is just a lot of the occult, really, with sort of a high church Anglican view of worship. That was once a significant movement. They're still around today. Spiritism, that has a link with Arthur Conan Doyle, known for Sherlock Holmes. There's a Spiritist church right down the street from our church here in Westchester, Ohio, and they meet on Sundays to talk to the dead, to talk to the spirits of the dead. And if it's either a sham or a fraud, or if it's successful, they're speaking to devils, and there's usually a devil or two at the switchboard, more than happy to make the connection. That's Spiritism. That was a very important part of late 19th century American religious movements, and as I say, it is still around today. Far more to our point would be a discussion of modernism. How do we define modernism? It's a system which desires to see the complete transformation of revealed religion, Roman Catholicism, according to the ideas of the age, of the times. Get with it, modern times. It accepts the philosophical conclusions of Kant and all the rationalists that it is impossible to prove anything in religion. You can't really prove the existence of God. It is impossible to hold that there actually was a supernatural revelation. But on the other hand, there are those who are known as immanentists, and they teach that God is identified with everybody's subconscious, and that religion is merely, this is classic, where we're here with classic modernism, religion is just the outgrowth, it's just the expression of interior religious experience. So religious experience, that's, you think of Tyrrell or Duchenne, Loisy, or von Hugel. It's something purely subjective, and it's personal to you, but at the same time, it's common to all of mankind. And you see how modernism steps out of the stagnant pool of German philosophy, Kant, and the whole idea of subjectivism, my personal experience. This finds an expression as well in the modern distinction between religion. Oh, I'm not religious anymore. But I'm spiritual. I'm a spiritual person. That all is a flowering of modernism. Old Catholicism. Now, Old Catholic or Old Catholicism, that's a contradictory term if ever there was one. Those liberal Catholics who rejected papal authority, and in particular really chafed at the idea of Pius IX, his boldness in calling an ecumenical council to define the always held Catholic teaching of papal infallibility. They wouldn't accept it. And so some of them broke away, especially in German-speaking countries, founded a movement known as Old Catholicism, claiming that they were holding, what the Catholic Church had really taught all the way through. But really, it's what the Catholic Church was subjected to during the era of the Enlightenment. Ignaz Dolinger is considered the founder of the Old Catholic movement, although he didn't actually do that himself. Others did, but it uses his name. Amongst their positions are, Old Catholicism is really yet another form of R&R, recognize and resist, isn't it? That is to say, they recognize the man as the Pope, but they resist him because, like the R&R people, they believe in freedom of thought in theological matters. We don't have to submit ourselves to the Roman Pontiff. They also promoted anticipated many of the changes, the marriage of the clergy, the vernacular in worship, and a classic modernistic approach towards theology. There are still so-called old Catholics around today. Because of their free system of the consecration of bishops and the ordination of priests, they are at the source of many people who enjoy playing church and have what's known as home churches. And so very often traditional Catholics might come across, just by chance, some sort of a chapel or church or an advertisement for a group that is, we would say, old Catholic. That is to say that it's somebody who's a plumber and then he wants to be a priest on the side. And he might present himself as a traditional Catholic, attempting to say the Latin Mass, or he might present himself as a modern Catholic, and he might not even be he. It could be a she. But those are all some of the descendants of the old Catholic movement of the 19th century. And we Catholics, simple, without any etiquette in front of our name, we Catholics reject that entirely. And this whole sort of an old Catholic polity of just ordaining men, right? That's growing more and more in the traditional movement. We'll probably have to do some sort of a show about that sooner or later, too. So, but I did want to mention it because when our listeners hear the phrase old Catholic, some of them will think of it in those terms. Then there's the ecumenical movement, which starts with a movement of named after this ecumenism, was originally known as reunionism. The idea of a reunion or a corporate reunion of the Church of England, especially the High Church part of the Church of England, with the Roman Catholic Church. And it was based upon an Anglican concept of what's called the branch theory. The branch theory holds that the Church of Christ has three branches: the Anglicans, the Greek and Russian Orthodox, and the Roman Catholic Church. Of course, today, with subsist in and the whole Vatican II ecumenical theology, this has been superseded largely. But this is how it's got its start. And Lord Halifax, in his discussions, his theological discussions, played a great role in that. These are the forerunners of the ecumenical movement. Very, very important, obviously, because so much happened in the name of ecumenism. Then we spoke a little bit earlier today about Americanism. That is to say, it's akin to modernism, which holds that in order to make converts, the church should relax her rules and indeed sort of reinterpret the very deposit of faith itself, and see and present everything in a way that's pleasing to non-Catholics and supposedly just based upon reason and common sense. The idea of man submitting his intellect before God the revealer, that would be out the window. Modern Americanism also, of course, holds that the so-called active virtues are much more important than the so-called passive ones, and that we need priests and teachers who are out there in society, and the idea of nuns behind a cloister grill or monks, Trappists, working and chanting in their monasteries. That's passé. That's finished. So a lot of the Americanism really gives us a lot of the ideas of applied modernism, and it's American and at the same time French in its origin. These ideas were condemned by Pope Leo XIII. Last but not least, if anyone is still out there, we could speak about some trends in art, some trends in music, some trends in literature. I guess this would classify as the dessert. We've had our vegetables, and now we finish the steak course. Now, this maybe would be a little bit of dessert. Trouble is, a lot of people say, no, thank you. I've had enough. But
well, if not, you can order the cheese, Your Excellency, because
you can always order the cheese. That's right. They will offer you that option, and maybe with a good red, the meal looks interesting again, right? Romanticism. But this is important because this Romanticism is a musical carrying out of the ideas of the Enlightenment, especially of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the denial of original sin, that the most noble act that man is capable of performing is human feeling, sentiment, and this Rousseau's noble contribution is that of the noble savage, that man, in his primitive instincts, is far better and should be left alone and honored as such instead of chained up by the conventions of modern society. They would hold that. So Romanticism holds that all of the interior instincts of man, his sentiment, his feelings, all of that is necessarily good. So this is rooted in the idea of Immanuel Kant in his philosophy. It places subjective, personal feeling over any kind of objective truth. Mind, again, makes for reality, and so its influence, the influence of Romanticism over the arts, would be to idealize everything to the point of falsification. So everything that should be sort of fantastic or exaggerated, whether it be literature with a kind of a new mythology of man, the deification of man, in effect, or whether it be music. Human natural virtues are over-dramatized and over-exalted. The natural, this world, is supernaturalized, and that's all that really matters. Some modern fiction stands, Wuthering Heights is a good, Ivanhoe, that might be another example. In music, the common, the daily, the ordinary, that becomes exalted. Bishop Samwer says that Beethoven's sixth, I think Bishop Williamson probably would disagree, but maybe not. Beethoven's Sixth Symphony would be an example of this exaltation of the banal and the lowly. Schiller's Ode to Joy, memorialized in Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique would be another example of that. That's a little bit about Romanticism in music, feeling, sentiment. That's what you're going for. That's what you've got to feel good. So you can see how the connection between that and modern music and modern entertainment in general, or the modern so-called arts in general. As regards art, you find, again, the idea of the glorification of the ordinary. That starts with the Dutch. That starts with the Northern European painters after the Reformation. They couldn't paint saints anymore, so and Madonnas. So now they're going to paint landscapes, and they're going to paint wealthy burghers and glorify the people who commission their paintings, glorify money and domestic scenes. But then at the same time, there will be the glorification of the Revolution itself, because that was the big theme during so much of the last 2 centuries. So you have Delacroix, his Liberty at the Barricades. Bergoglio would like him because he portrays human liberty as big and messy, sort of, and but at the same time glorious. And this is what we should look up to. This is what we should exalt. This is what we should view all of this as noble. So in the modern movement of Romanticism, you have the idealization of false virtues and of all the movements, really, of the lower nature, that's eventually going to deliver you to the concept of the anti-hero, the cultivation of people's vices in literature and in art. And for this reason, the modern movie star is glorified in the public eye, since he's the source of, he's done something so-called supposedly important on the screen in some dramatic or emotional sense, and he leads a dramatic life off the screen, and so therefore we should sort of abandon our lives to follow his very immoral life and be interested in it. And we end up with the glorification of all human vice as our chief means of entertainment. Romanticism, that's an important ism. It explains a lot about what's going on in music and art and literature in the modern world and today. Romanticism is linked by means of Immanuel Kant and idealism with another movement in art called Impressionism. This departs from the idea of representational art, classical and realistic. Now it's going to be the artist's personal or subjective impression, his impression of the forms. Remember Kant talking about all you can know are the forms. That the object of our knowledge, remember he claims, is not any real object as it exists objectively out there, but it's just our personal impression of some object, how it seems or appears to us. So Monet, Renoir, all of the great French 19th century and 20th century artists are going to be in the school, and they're still today so highly appreciated, so highly exalted. In music, think of a Debussy, L'après-midi d'une faune, the afternoon of a faun. In all these art forms, you see the continuation of this 19th century phenomenon of the glorification of, at the very best, the ordinary, the daily, the French term for it, the banal. And at the very worst, it's going to lead you to the glorification of that which is horrible and ugly and discordant, and it's going to leave you feeling worse rather than better. I think a good definition of modern music is anything which, if you turn it off, is going to make you feel better. And the definition of classical music, anything which is good, is that when you listen to it, it makes you feel better. It elevates you. It inspires you. But modern music, you just want to turn it off. And modern art, you just want to turn away from it. I think Impressionism is sort of the artistic version of Vatican II. That is to say, there are all these vaguely nice notions, and you should really appreciate them, but there's nothing there because it's designed in a very subjective or personalistic sense, and as a way of trying to appeal to everyone.
So it's like Oakland, Your Excellency. There's no there there.
There's no there there, exactly. I'm afraid so. Music.
Your Excellency, I wanted to say at this point, some people might be shifting around in their chairs, whispering to whoever they're listening to the episode with, say, but I like Beethoven, but I like Monet. Does His Excellency mean I'm not supposed to like Monet? If we're talking about the root of the rot, are we discovering some rot in our love of this music and our love of these types of art?
Absolutely. Let's be fair and go back a little farther back in history, and consider Mozart. What good Catholic would not proclaim as totally and absolutely glorious the masses of Mozart? Yeah, Mozart was a Freemason. He was a member of a so-called Catholic lodge, but he was a Freemason. So you don't have to feel guilty for liking Mozart, and you don't have to feel guilty for liking Beethoven, but you should know how it went. You should know, literally, the root of the rot. And you should know, too, a little bit about what, particularly Beethoven's Sixth Symphony or the Ode to Joy. You should know the effect that has on you and what he's really glorifying. And you should know if the next time the Monet comes to your local museum and you feel rather virtuous and highly cultural because you've gone in to see it and you're really appreciating it very much, or you're making a pilgrimage not only to Saint-Denis but also to Giverny, and to see the wonderful gardens that inspired all of this great impressionistic art. You should know you should put it into context, as we tried to contextualize earlier in this program, the concordats. So to put this into context, just understand that. No, in se, this is not to be condemned. There is much in se, in and of itself, which would have to be condemned. But see, we're on the slippery slope here, people. See where we're going with all of this. Put it into context, and then. Because the point of this series is to enable you to answer the question, how did it happen? Well, Monet and Beethoven have something to contribute to the rot, just as much as Immanuel Kant or Napoleon, or the great Freemasons of the Enlightenment, the encyclopedists. That's all. That's all. So please don't feel guilty if you enjoy your Monet.
So you're just saying that the rot's just a little prettier, Your Excellency.
Yes, the rot is, yes. Well, as a matter of fact,
it doesn't smell so bad.
There's no stench. It's rather pleasing. Those are pleasing pastels, and stirring Beethoven chords. But if you put it into context, actually you'd see it in a different sense from now on. And there should be at least one slight pause for an interior shudder, and maybe you might want to step back.
Well, it's fascinating. Your Excellency, thinking about what you're talking about, just listening to those pieces, I'm juxtaposing two in my mind, both of which I was blessed to attend with some clergy. I saw Beethoven's Ninth. I've seen that performed twice, and I've seen Mozart's Missa in C minor. Mm-hmm. And the contrasting feelings, don't want to get too deep into feelings, but the sentiment that's aroused when you're sitting, listening to a mass, and how you feel like you're floating up somewhere.
Yeah.
And listening to Beethoven, and I'm ready for someone to put a torch in my hand, and I'm going to go march in the streets afterwards.
Yes, to the barricades. Yes, exactly.
Yes, I'm ready. I mean, tell me whatever I'm supposed to be protesting. I'm ready after this music, and it's pedantry. I mean, it's telling you, the music is telling you what to do. It's just that, now we have they play records backwards, and, Pink Floyd is telling you to go burn a house down or something. And that's demonic, and everyone sees that that's evil. But, if you're refined and you're sitting and you're in a suit and you're in a concert hall and Beethoven's telling you, well, it's okay then.
And isn't that haven't you touched upon one of the really great themes of the challenge of being a Catholic? That is to say, if you've got some grungy, long-haired hippie type who's preaching communism at you, or having a demonstration in the street, it's very easy to hold your nose and walk away and condemn them as quickly as possible. If you are sitting next to somebody who's well scrubbed and well dressed, and you're in a concert hall, a rather beautiful concert hall, perhaps with gilding and crystal lights and chandeliers and everything, and they're doing some wonderful wonderful classical music. Isn't this what we're fighting for? Isn't this part of the great civilization of the West? No, this is part of the problem. So it's a two-faceted problem, pro minimo for the very least, and our audience needs to be able to recognize that. If you don't, you'll be taken in. That's why the importance of considering the root of the rot. So those who have money and who have power and who love beauty, or some version thereof, are often going to hit upon things that will seem very appealing to us, whereas the real ISIS revolutionary chopping off kids' heads will just reject it entirely and out of hand. But pause, step back, eat your spinach, and think about the links here. And by all means, do think. That's very important. See, as you were talking earlier about Beethoven, I thought to myself, two B's here, Beethoven and, yes, Bergoglio, because the idea of wanting to run out to the barricades, right, get a torch, and that's Bergoglio's much beloved concept of this Leo, the chaos. That's what he wants. And it's an odd thing, isn't it, that soon after he took over the Vatican, he refused to attend a concert that had already been scheduled, and he made a big deal about his humility and was sitting and listening to classical music performed in a concert. That's for princes, and he wasn't a church prince. He was busy, creating a little chaos someplace else. But that's modern music. That's Beethoven. You're right. You've got your finger on it. That's what it's about. It's to move us towards this stuff, whereas good music moves us in an entirely different direction. I think of Bach's Mass in B minor and the magnificent Kyrie. how that lifts the soul up in this plea for mercy before God's throne. Entirely different feeling for it.
I think directionally, Your Excellency, it moves us up, not forward, not in the direction of progress, right?
And that's why it has to be rejected out of hand as something just for another age or for princes, I guess. But last but not least, just a little bit word about the final utter degradation, which still appeals to the cheat sheet, to the modern wealthy classes, but this is where, fortunately, no traditional Catholics, no true Catholics are going to be deceived. Abstract art and atonal music, this movement of Impressionism we've been discussing last of all, was just the beginning of this radical departure from objectivity, from objective truth. The principle that the mind dominates reality and is itself the source of reality. So this idea of Immanuel Kant and all the subjectivists, it's going to find its ultimate expression in art and in music. So the artist portrays his subject in some grotesque form. That's Bishop Sanborn's phrase, and that's perfectly true. And that's modern art, isn't it? Some grotesque form that you're meant to ooh and ah over and pay perhaps hundreds of thousands of dollars to possess, say, a Picasso or a Jackson Pollock. This type of painting refuses the nature such as God created it, and it refuses the whole idea of nature as somehow a reflection of Almighty God. Man tries to make his own nature, his fallen nature, his confused, wretched, ugly, dark, and sinful nature, kind of a counter nature that's to be held up and admired. And so all of the principles of order, that have to be found in any form of real art, harmony, balance, proportion, that's all scoffed at. And is replaced with this whole new set of principles in all the forms of modern art, including literature: disorder, discord, imbalance, disproportion. So you see it. You see it then in the arts, an actual representation of these awful philosophical ideas, just as you see in a modern Novus Ordo service, a modern Novus Ordo church, the exaltation of what? The banal at the very best, the ugly, the offensive, the aggressively revolting, right in your face, because that's the philosophy, the theology. Now you're going to see its actual expression in representational art or music or writing. Same thing is going to be, it's this diabolic love of the ugly for being ugly. And other people are supposed to really ooh and ah over it. And the same thing, of course, last of all, will be in music. You've got Arnold Schoenberg or Stravinsky, the development of the atonal music. The classical and the 8-tone scale is now discarded for a discordant 12-tone scale, which could vary with each piece very, very subjectively. The whole classical metric system is altered. Everything has to be offbeat, out of proportion, imbalance. Everything else of the Novus Ordo loves to have everything off balance in their sanctuaries, in their ceremonies. There's a reason for that.
Well, it's as you're speaking about your I'm laughing because in my youth, about 5 minutes ago, I would go to some of these modern exhibits, or I'd listen to modern classical music, and I always asking myself, do I not get it? Am I not getting it? Over time, I've come to realize that modern art needs commentary because it's so horrible. It's these emperor's new clothes, right? Well, you need commentary. It's sort of like the Novus Ordo needed commenters because they need to explain to you how terrible their service was. Mm-hmm. And so all these people are wandering around these modern art galleries, and they're looking at a Rothko, which is this black rectangle.
Yes.
And I'm looking at it. I look to my left and to my right at other people who are looking at it. And I'm thinking to myself, people are they're trying to make people feel like they're dumb, like they don't get it. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, well, you don't get it. Right. And a hallmark of modern art is you need an explanation. And I suppose that's the beauty of Catholicism, Your Excellency, is it's the art of the obvious.
Yes.
It doesn't require a whole lot of explanation.
I just read something from a very interesting piece from Novus Ordo Dominican, in which he was attempting to maintain some sort of a distinction, like the old Mass and the old way, that would require all this explanation. Whereas you see in the new way, everything is very simple, and the people can grasp it immediately without any sort of a commentary. Whereas it's exactly the truth, as often the case, is exactly the opposite. A man off the street, including, and this says a lot, a modern man off the street can come into one of our masses, whether it be a silent low mass on a weekday or whether it be a gorgeous pontifical mass on a feast, and immediately perceive what's going on and derive all sorts of benefit from it, and despite himself, be drawn into it in some sense, if he shows even just a little bit of willingness on his part. That's our experience in weddings and funerals and Christmas, and people will always be saying things because they're touched by it. They don't need anybody explaining anything. It's all obvious. It's elaborate layers of ceremonial and music. It's true, but it's open to everybody for his understanding without any fuss. Whereas your Novus Ordo, that has to be explained, and that's why the Novus Ordo ministers are always explaining this and explaining that, because they've stepped away from the natural in their abhorrence of the supernatural, and so they have to always be explaining to people, talk about what they're attempting to accomplish. As you say, at a modern museum, looking at some canvas is painted black, and someone will have to explain to you its glories and why you should pay so much money for it. The Emperor's New Clothes.
Well, I suppose the Emperor's New Clothes is a good place for us to end. We started with Emperor Napoleon today, yes. So we'll end with his false clothes that he's spread out all over Europe and consequently all over the world. As always, Your Excellency, thanks so much for your time. What's going on at St. Gertrude's these days?
At St. Gertrude, we are getting ready for our 40 Hours devotion, which opens Friday night, the 24th, and continues through Sunday night, the 26th. We're probably one of the few churches in the world which has, for over 30 years consecutively, each year performed this traditional Catholic devotion of the solemn masses, the adoration of the Blessed Sacrament for 40 hours, and the processions. So that's, for us, that's a very, very important part of our life. And then that, of course, will lead into All Saints and All Souls, the Holy Day Masses, the double Vespers, the Vespers of, this year will be the Vespers of the Sunday that lead into the Vespers of the Dead, and then the opening of the observance of All Souls on Monday, November 3rd, with the possibility of the faithful gaining the, so often, indulgence known as the toties quoties, as long as, and I hasten to point this out since you have given me an opening, as long as they pray according to the mind of the Church. The Pope's intentions simply mean the exaltation of the Catholic faith, the propagation of the faith, the suppression of heresy, and peace and concord amongst Christian princes, and in general, the needs of the Church. That's what that phrase means. And when you say your Our Fathers, 6 Our Fathers, Hail Marys, and Glory Bees, that's what you're praying for. And each time you visit a church this year it's noon on Sunday, the 2nd, through midnight on Monday, the 3rd, you may gain a plenary indulgence under the other usual conditions as well, of course, for the poor souls in purgatory, and they certainly do need our assistance. And
you're reminding people, Your Excellency, that you don't have to have a pope in position in order to take advantage of this indulgence.
Absolutely not. That must be one of the 10 most popular false notions or misunderstandings amongst traditional Catholics today. But no, not required at all. Not part of the system, no.
All right. Good. Well, Your Excellency, as always, thanks so much for your time. We look forward to having you on our next episode where we'll talk about some more rot.
More rot, and next time we want to talk about the fire that Freemasonry set throughout the whole world, and some of the great conflagrations, the practical modern results of Freemasonic and Enlightenment thinking.
Thanks so much for your time, Your Excellency.
You're very welcome. God bless you.
all of us here at the Restoration Radio Network would ask that if you found our work, this episode, to be informative, helpful, in any way beneficial to you and to your faith, please consider sending a note of thanks to the clergy who help make our network worthwhile. If you have any questions for His Excellency on this episode or any of the past episodes, you can write to him at rootoftherot@truerestoration.org. Remember that above and beyond material contributions, the most important donation you can make to our work here is prayer. Please think of offering a rosary, a mass, or even an Ave for our work the next time you pray. For the Restoration, I'm Stephen Heiner. May God bless you.
This program was brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org. That's novusordowatch.org.